it looks like we're coming close to 3:30, and at that point, I'm going to turn the time over to Kelly Kendro, who is going to introduce our speaker. So,
yeah, I can start the introduction. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the University of Utah Department of Linguistics March Colloquium. We're so happy that you could all join us, whether it's in person here at the department or remotely. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that those of us here in Salt Lake City today are joining us from the unceded ancestral lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. A language is, of course, inextricably linked to the human experiences, and we must recognize that this nation's history of colonization and forced assimilation with regards to indigenous languages and peoples, as we discuss race and privilege, multilingualism, multidialectalism, and ethics and equity in our own research. So we invite you to contemplate this dimension of the study of language, as well as our own obligations as linguists and affiliated researchers during today's talk about linguistics in a hostile workplace. And I think I just remembered to put on captions, so I'm going to have captions on. So sorry about that. So I'm honored and excited to introduce our colloquium speaker, Dr. Kelly Wright. I'm very fortunate to count Dr. Wright as a colleague and friend. She earned her MA in Linguistic Theory and Typology from the University of Kentucky in 2017, and her PhD in Linguistics from the University of Michigan in 2022. Dr. Wright is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of English at Virginia Tech, where she investigates the intersection of race and linguistics and related topics spanning sociophonetics, lexicography, corpus linguistics, sociosemantic change, and among others. In addition to her current position at Virginia Tech, Dr. Wright has also been a Lansdowne visiting scholar at the University of Victoria, and she has received several prestigious honors and awards, including the Mellon Fellowship for Publicly Engaged Humanities, the 2019 Rackham Scholar Activist Award, and the Rackham Merit Fellowship. She is co-editor of American Speeches Among the New Words column and a Linguistic Society of America media liaison, and she serves as the American Dialect Society's New Word Committee and the Oxford English Dictionary Researchers Advisory Group. Dr. Wright has published in top journals, including Applied Linguistics, Annual Review of Linguistics, and American Speech, and her work in raciolinguistics has received international attention and acclaim, including interviews and articles and publications such as the New York Times, The Economist, and BBC World Service. She has also appeared on podcasts, including Because Language, Under Standardized English, and the Vocal Prize, and has written public essays for Medium and ESPN. Today's talk, titled Awareness, Objectification, and Equity, Linguistics in a Hostile Workplace, discusses the relationship between diachronic embodied perception and linguistic injustice. The talk will be followed by a Q&A session, which will wrap up at around 4:30 Mountain Time. And then we're going to invite students to stay on and continue talking to Dr. Wright until about 5 p.m. Mountain Time. With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to our speaker, and thank you for joining us today, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. Oh my goodness. Okay, here we go. Oh, may I share?
Absolutely. Let me just.
Thanks. No.
Sorry.
This is so great. You're like, yeah, your summary of what I was like.
Goodness.
That is what I'm going to talk about.
Okay. It says you should be able to share.
Okay. Yes, I can. Thank you. Here we go. All right. So you heard their land acknowledgement. Here's mine. I live on the Tutuelo and Monacan people's homeland and work for Virginia Tech, which sits on their land and was built by enslaved Black people. All right. Thank you very much for that fantastic introduction. I begin all of my work with a positionality statement because marking our positionality when we take up a place of power is direct action we can engage in, which cements equity in our world. And so I will tell you that I am Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. I'm a Black biracial cisgender woman from Appalachia, and I identify as a member of the queer community. I am currently a postdoctoral research fellow in language sciences at Virginia Tech. I am working class, and while I am not first gen in the way that most traditionally use the term, I am one generation removed from educational segregation. I'll be speaking for about 40 minutes today, and I'll begin with a discussion of how embodied perception stretched over time interacts with institutions to create the conditions for linguistic oppression. We'll move from considering a handful of examples of illustrative examples to a discussion of the remarkable challenge of objectifying language data. And then I'll briefly share aspects of a methodology I developed to address some of these challenges. I've left plenty of time for us to have an active large group discussion at the end because Dr. Jarvis informed me you all are interested in finding ways to commit your expertise to social justice, and I'd like to be a resource for that if I can while we're together today. I'll also mention briefly that these slides are available at the bit.ly link here, and they include a full transcript in lieu of sign interpretation for this event, or if you just prefer to read along instead of hearing me drone on. All right, so let's begin by thinking about perception. Our senses give us the ability to perceive. So smell, touch, taste, hear, and see, and our brains partition that information into discrete, meaningful elements. We are able to determine if something is dark or light, near or far, or if we are hearing a da or a ta. This information is processed in real time. It's categorized in our minds based on all of our collective previous experience of the world. Those are just the basic things we sense that we can be aware of, but language is anything but basic. You cannot make language without a body. Language issues from living sources. Even modalities which may be long removed from the human who created them presuppose another human's presence when we interact with them. Other things we interact with, smells, for example, can radiate from the environment. It could be a tree or even the air itself producing a recognizable pattern when perceived, but those patterns are not inherently social ones. Linguistic perception is inherently social because production is inherently embodied. When we experience language, we always know there's a body involved, our own or someone else's, and our bodies place us at the center of our own stories about what we perceive. The meaning-making process in our minds is designed to be a relativistic and thus egocentric one. This is one reason Miles Hercules et al. Argue in their typological comparison that we see deictic expressions like out west, next door, down the road a piece, across the world's languages, taking up egocentric points of reference. In the center of our own stories, then, we come to adapt to the patterns around us most often, which are our own language use, the language of our parents, our immediate communities, etc. Focusing primarily on the perception of voices, embodied positionality is taken into account when we hear someone else because we have certain knowledge about the ways bodies are expected to behave. Why do we have that knowledge? Well, we are right here in the present about to use some language. We aren't stationed in the depth of time trying to communicate and making the first attempts at describing life ever. The social history of the world has occurred. Time's arrow flies forward and will continue flying forward, dragging us all along with it. When we externalize thought, we're doing a little bit more than vibrating a sack of meat, it turns out. When the voice emerges from any given body, its meaning will always be interpreted in context relative to the individual user. What this tells us is that no two individuals can create meaning in the same way in any modality. And by extending this reality to its furthest application, there is therefore no so-called right way to use language. This is something that is simply not definable due to the embodied nature of communication. Language use and the meaning which derives from it is in fact completely relative and individualized. Perhaps we can take time to marvel at the literal physics of how you have even once accomplished communication in the face of that revelation another day. How we are even doing it right now in different time zones with different sets of vowels in our heads. The phenomena of languaging continuously, smoothly, without much effort, and with most of the individuals you have ever encountered should marvel you, but I digress. Now, I know that most of you, depending on your settings, can only see my head, but it is my understanding that to most observers, I am perceived as having a female-coded body. Perceiving me in this body sets expectations for the ways in which I may behave during this event. And if I confirm or violate those expectations, those actions may signal or trigger a new or different characterization in this audience because I've traipsed beyond the boundaries of the social role, which was initially anticipated or assigned to me. I use all sorts of linguistic material here to illuminate this effect. But this brief exercise is enough to demonstrate that while meaning is certainly a thing, it can be understood as more of a product of conventionality than of universal truth. Everything we've considered, how the realities of embodied communication tell us that arbitrary or standardized linguistic targets are unnatural, has been in a perfect world. Essentially, we've set up an equation for meaning, but we haven't yet hit play. We haven't fed any data into this system. In theory, this system should operate entirely equitably for all users, whether it defines a target for production or not. But we know this is decidedly not the case. We know there are instances in which context, audience, and linguistic material can be held constant, but a difference in embodiment can significantly condition outcomes, intentionally or unintentionally, for a language user. When we hit play and the social history of the world unfolds over generations of human communicative development, a preference for certain ways of languaging becomes baked into the ways in which our bodies are capable of externalizing thought. This is what linguistic oppression comes down to at its core. Across time and across communities, the ways in which most people have had open to them to use language in the world has not been entirely free. There is no moral judgment in that statement, merely an observation of environmental constraints. These patterns of oppression are incredibly old. They are older than every living human being. They are older than the printing press. And these engines, which turn what Silverstein referred to as the irreducible dialectic of linguistic production and perception, are one force which has been shaping language variation and change since the beginning. As we move forward, I am going to describe to you some examples which blatantly illustrate linguistic oppression, which demonstrate how social role and embodiment always influence the ways in which minoritized language users can and do produce language. But I want to make it clear that the phenomena I am discussing actually extend to all of us, that no one group is specifically at fault for what I am describing, that the examples I present are where we can most clearly see these forces at work, because in other centralized and less obviously marginalized communities, their effects are more insidious, private, and often subconscious. The big picture to frame the information I am sharing today within is that of human cognition generally and linguistic production and perception specifically. The extent to which someone can exploit the range of expectations available in a given context is mediated entirely by embodied positionality. And this is the foundational observation which underlies Flores and Rosa's concept of raciolinguistic ideologies, which tell us that there is an association between certain bodies and linguistic deficiency that exists no matter how individuals are producing language. Because bodies cannot be separated from the production of language or their place in society, people who exist in certain types of bodies never produce language in any form that is perceived as proper or standard or respectful or complete or complex or clear or clean or civil or good enough. I'm going to walk us through some specific examples from our shared history, which I hope will demonstrate that language standards do not evolve out of natural laws, but instead represent the preferred linguistic repertoire of the powerful that constrains an individual's linguistic production in a given context. So let's start then in the Christian Bible and encounter therein the book of Judges and the concept of a shibboleth. This may be familiar to some in the room. Some may know this term as synonymous with password, but as the allegory goes, in a battle between Ephraim and Gilead, 40,000 Ephraimites were slain on the banks of the river Jordan before crossing into Gilead because of their inability to pronounce shibboleth, essentially killed for having an accent which identified them as foreigners. But this is just a Bible story, right? Things like this don't happen in real life. How could a single word in your vocabulary that sounds different get you killed? So what is now known as the Parsley Massacre occurred during the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic in 1937 in very similar circumstances to what I just described in the Bible story. Darker-skinned Haitians were crossing into the Dominican Republic via the Dajabon River and were tested on their pronunciation of a shibboleth term, parsley. And if they used the French version with a uvular trill, rather than the Spanish version with an alveolar trill, then they were murdered. Per rahil, per rahil, per rahil, per rahil. You can imagine with a phonemic difference that subtle that many people were killed just because they were brown. These two brief examples illustrate the ways in which, both in our belief and our history, humans have policed racialized boundaries of belonging with standardized pronunciation. I want to turn now to some of my research, which captures racialized boundary maintenance in the media through lexical usage asymmetries. Racialized media is terminology that is somewhat more common now. Some of you may have even caught it mentioned in the Meghan and Harry specials that have been making the rounds. But in 2015, this concept was one that needed to be proven, defended, and re-exemplified time and again. And that was by the scientists who were working on it. Lexical racialization happens when a word with no pre-existing racial connotation comes to describe people of color asymmetrically. What this pattern looks like and what the literature predicts are terms that are focused on the body, its physical prowess and skill, and or uncharacteristically intense words. The latter is incredibly common with Serena Williams, who initially inspired this work and whose traditionally segregated world of tennis must recognize her presence in a way that does not reflect the obvious exceptionality of her color. And so from very, very early on in her career, we see her described as things like superhuman and the GOAT, among other things. To analyze this, they built a corpus of sports journalism called the RCC, or the Racialized Semantics in Athletics corpus, which contains 120 athletes over 100 years and is balanced for race and gender. I developed a machine learning algorithm, a support vector machine, to aid in the objective classification of these data. Simply put, the goal here is a revelation of the informational content of this large body of text. The SVM is not designed to be an automatic racism detector. Its task is to use raw lexical token counts to separate the corpus into two meaningful groups. And remember that this data set is balanced for race and gender, but surprise, the meaningful groups are organized by race. Now, normally we would expect the difference between Aaliyah Atkinson in the Black subcorpus and Hope Solo in the white subcorpus here to be 49 versus 51%, and for this classification of membership to gradually decrease or increase from there. But we see this stark divide with no gradients. And that's a surprising result, so much so that I reran this test several times and had field experts check the outcome for errors, but no, the algorithm was sure, like super sure who belonged in which group. So the next question is, how did it arrive at that output? The random forest model allows us to understand which words were most useful in the SVM's racial categorization task, which words were important. And scanning down this column here, we find that they're perhaps not the kinds of words we were expecting. The word like athletic, for example, is predicted to be distributed equally because each athlete being described in this corpus is world class. However, we see here that there is an imbalance with more occurrences appearing in the Black subcorpus. I typically assess each of these uses in context to determine which senses of a given term are being applied, and if differently, how so. But I'd like to deviate slightly and share some real-world examples instead of experimental outcomes here, which illustrate this phenomenon. I did bring the slides about those findings, though, so if you want to ask, please do. During the 2018 World Cup, Bourdieu pointed out that commentators were using racialized language to describe the match depicted here on the left between Poland and Senegal. The comments focused on Senegalese players' athleticism. A Canadian researcher, Sam Gregory, decided to run with that and see if the two-dimensional renderings you see on the right that data analytics companies use for various purposes could be applied as a test bed for measuring racial attitudes. Gregory and colleagues played 2-minute clips of either the broadcast on the left or the animation on the right to participants and asked them which players seemed more athletic. And they find that for the participants who viewed the broadcast, 70% reported the all-Black Senegalese players were more athletic. And compared to the participants who viewed the rendering of the broadcast, 62% reported that the all-white Polish players were more athletic. It's difficult to compare those percentages directly, so I've included this P number here to show that that is a highly significant outcome. Mueller reported these findings, stated, quote, the physical advantages that supposedly define the African team's style of play disappeared as soon as their skin color did. So this example, I hope, puts the imbalances in uses of athletic in my corpus in some more context, but I'm going to share just one more example before we move on. And that is from German news coverage of the Moroccan team's historic placement in the 2022 World Cup quarterfinals. Here we see a Moroccan player, Sabiri, wearing his national flag and pointing upwards after his team advanced, a gesture which was very quickly equated to a symbolic sign of allegiance with the Islamic State, not the "we're number one" gesture of foam finger fame. This coverage demonstrates that real-world effects of raciolinguistic ideologies are unconstrained by the modality of linguistic production. This ideology shapes the expectations of those interacting with minoritized people and has consequences in institutions outside of athletics. Where such individuals are mistakenly perceived as possessing not only an inability to produce standardized or preferred varieties, but also a primitive aggression, physicality, and violence. In the institution of healthcare, we know that Black patients who report pain are 22% less likely to receive medication. And I attribute this phenomenon in part to violated expectations of semantic intensity. Most of us are likely familiar with semantic intensity as a cousin of hyperbole. We increase intensity all the time when we describe something because of how we feel about it. Like when we say that share is ageless or that pizza is sacred. But in this case, raciolinguistic ideologies affect semantic intensity from the other direction, creating an expectation of elevated descriptions of pain. Black people show up at an ER like, ow, ow, I'm hurting. But healthcare workers expect us to be like hulking out if we're experiencing something serious. Violated expectations of semantic intensity contribute to maintaining this very high maternal mortality rate, especially for Black women in healthcare. Something that was experienced by Serena Williams, who, despite having access to excellent healthcare and a documented history of blood clots, was not believed when she reported chest pain that was later diagnosed as a pulmonary embolism when she flatlined after delivering her daughter, Olympia. So part of the Black linguistic experience then is not being believed or taken seriously when reporting facts or events because of certain expectations about how we should be using language because of the bodies we are in. And sometimes when those expectations are violated, our lives are lost. We've considered a number of examples of linguistic oppression in a short time, but I could go on speaking to you about every institution there is, about how raciolinguistic ideologies contributed to placing Black language only in the mouths of monsters, villains, and buffoons in animation for over a century, or how inaccessible language on informed consent documents translates into on-the-job deaths, or more of my research, which demonstrates that non-standard speakers are prevented from living where they choose because of how they sound on the phone. What's important to recognize from these examples is that non-normatively embodied language users find no quarter in our built environment no matter what variety of language they are producing. With that groundwork laid, I hope you'll abide an abrupt transition into our consideration of language objectification and how that primary concern of our discipline can be taken up when facing all that embodied perception entails. My first mentor as a linguist was the late, great Dr. Michael Montgomery, whom I miss deeply, the author of the Dictionary of Appalachian English, which he's signing in this photo. When I was his intern, he would ask me, "What do linguists do?" And I would respond, "Study language scientifically." And he would say, "No, young lady, they study language as an object." I wish I could go back to this conversation now, because I replay it in my head all the time. And I feel like I am just beginning to understand what MM was getting at. It is the special challenge of linguistic inquiry to hold language still enough to look at it. This challenge has been omnipresent in our discipline because indeed, as Silverstein holds, language is irreducibly dialectic in nature. And it is the continual mediation of embodied linguistic production and perception through past and present human social history that contributes directly to this irreducibility. Early linguistic theorists addressed this challenge by proposing to analyze linguistic structure alone, severing produced linguistic material not only from its path through time, but also from its material history as well. This is akin to analyzing and describing a two-dimensional representation of language. Like when you go to the doctor's office and there's a poster slapped up on the wall of the skin or the heart with all the layers pulled back and internal workings exposed and labeled. Those systems aren't color-coded inside the body, nor do they manifest in nature in uniform size and shape. We accept what's on this poster as a useful abstraction. In a similar way, we do not have syntax trees in our brains, or at least we don't think we do. Like maybe some neurolinguists will disagree. Syntax trees are a useful abstraction. It's just what happens to be being abstracted away from. In the case of the heart and the case of language are significantly different in terms of the ways in which the removal of extant variation and its effects may shape the underlying theory as a result. Not feeding information about a patient's usage of grammaticalized done, or the verbal mastery when playing the dozens, or their gender expression into the theoretical models for cardiac muscle structure likely wouldn't have long-term implications for how this two-dimensional representation is employed in the field in real time or over time. But we know that leaving such things out of our theoretical models of linguistic structure has had some stark implications. Now, the best definition I have for language is the materialization of thought. And reckoning with that and everything else we've discussed today calls me towards a more three-dimensional representation of language data. Whether we are speaking, writing, or signing, language is an embodied product. It issues from the bodies of individuals, which places certain physical, and by this I am referencing capital P physical, restrictions on its manifestation, right? Like there are some sounds we just can't make, very difficult to produce ingressive and egressive airflow simultaneously. Bodies also have inextricable social history. Our color, our gender, our size, our age, our ability, all shape the ways in which we can and do produce language, no matter where or when we are. Confronting language as an object calls us to understand all of these material consequences of language production. We do, in the moment, have agency to choose a form from our repertoire. Variation is real, and so is the discursive actualization of self. Yes, neologisms and creativity are a thing, but those forms don't manifest without history. They are material. They come into being issuing from bodies that already have meaning in history, in contexts that have meaning in history, in places that have meaning in history, in the unfolding and unstoppable arcing gyre of space-time. Considering this, considering language as an object, the two-dimensional poster on the wall hyperstructural view of language is at best atomistic and at worst unethically incomplete. We must use all the data. And if the two-dimensional view is atomistic, then yes, I am asking you to consider the universe. Before we start to lose our collective shit over the task I have just laid before you, let us recognize that plenty of natural sciences already do this, already account for all of the material in the system under study. And guess what? Their models far outstrip our own. Quantum physics, astrophysics, cosmology, but also modern biology, geology, even disciplines like public health, economics, and marketing take a universal analytic view and consider to the best of their ability the full material properties of their system under study to best predict its behavior. Taking this full accounting approach is a challenge because we, like physicists, can never actually view the system we are studying in its entirety. We are inside it. Language is too large for us to see. Y'all really got to read Use of Newton sometime. Look at how he reckons with planetary oscillation by comparing it to linguistic systems. It's a real treat. We can never set ourselves outside the system such that we could stand back and look at it, hold it still, describe it. That's probably why the founders of our field never tried. But we can look at facets in their entirety. We do this when we interview an individual or embed ourselves in a community or query a body of text. When we ask our participants only to read a word list, nas, what, ras, pras, lam, nan, or have folks sit with us for 90 minutes, but our analytic goal is to merely count the number of times they said dat instead of that, we are ignoring the object placed in front of us. We describe its appearance, but not its purpose. When we don't use all the data, we rob ourselves of an opportunity to consider the fullness of the user's material experiences, which contribute to their linguistic production each day, which contribute to the evolution of language over time for our species. When we don't use all the data, we do not create and refine pathways towards fully analyzing or theorizing linguistic structure and function. The trees aren't enough. We have to look at the forest. I have made one good faith attempt at this at taking in a fuller picture of all the material factors at play when one is speaking, writing, or signing in my recently completed dissertation. Essentially, I challenge us to reset the two-dimensional scale at the universal level, to slap a new poster up on the wall, which depicts language use in a more realistic setting. This work introduces a new method of sociolinguistic interview and departs from a place of radical acceptance of a language user's expertise by prioritizing their knowledge of their own bodies, minds, contexts, and environments. The goal is not to elicit linguistic production for experimentation or phonetic analysis. The goal is to communicate with human beings about how they conceptualize their language use. It is centering them in the study of their own variation. This data was then carefully analyzed to reveal patterns in these observations across individuals who do not share bodies or home environments, and to establish which linguistic variables might be doing heavy perceptual lifting in specific shared contexts in the population writ large, like their workplace. Then, focused, incremental, and direct experimentation is conducted with large representative populations in the most accessible yet controlled conditions possible on the perception of specific linguistic material. That material being these potentially heavy lifting variables which have been identified by the population. The approach is necessarily interdisciplinary, and it must be so to allow for the analysis of linguistic objects as they exist in reality, which is in the middle of things. Now, metalinguistic awareness has been considered in the Western canon since Aristotle, but the definition I offer for it is the aspect of acquired or learned linguistic knowledge, which encompasses factors related to language use, knowledge, distribution, meaning, or occurrence variance. What do we know when we know a language? Well, we know how we use it. We know how we use it. We know how we use it. We possess knowledge of a vast set of rules for how utterances can and do exist in the world. The metalinguistic method of sociolinguistic interview, or MMSI, contains 7 sections and, not unlike a Lebavian interview, progresses the interviewee through stages and tasks which are geared towards eliciting different and increasingly richer types of meta-commentary. For this first application, I designed a protocol to elicit commentary on 5 key social factors, as well as other aspects of variance individuals could be expected to comment on. I interviewed 17 self-identified Black professionals from Detroit, 7 men and 10 women. 5 interviewees worked in the education sector, 3 in the nonprofit sector, and the other 9 came from different professions. In the interest of sharing findings from the perceptual experiment and leaving time for our discussion, I'm not going to share specific outcomes from the interviews, but please ask questions about these if you have them. The overall research question from the first iteration of these interviews was what motivates Black professionals to style shift towards the standard at work. The perception experiment asks how successful Black professionals are in making that movement towards more standard varieties, in appearing more professional in their workplace. In each experimental trial, listeners hear a pair of sentences only presented orally and choose which sentence sounds more professional, sentence A or sentence B. In each sentence pair, listeners hear sentences that differ in the number of non-standard variables. These 3 variables were chosen because interviewees cited them as aspects of their racialized styles that they shift away from in the practice of their professions. And in the case of Day, 90% of interviewees cited this feature as indicative of Detroit speech or sounding very city. There were 3 between subjects conditions tested in a fully randomized design, followed by a diagnostic pair, which was presented last to all of 300 listeners. I am going to present results which best demonstrate these variables and the ways in which they relate to each other. Here, outcomes for the diagnostic pair establish that the overwhelming majority of listeners across demographic categories reliably choose the all standard sentence as more professional sounding. That blue bar, much bigger than the red bar. Set 1 concerns the other 2 variables under study. It is arranged in the same way, where a listener chooses sentence A or sentence B in a fully randomized design. It could have appeared in any order before the diagnostic pair we just saw results for. Listeners are choosing, and so here it's 150 per group. They're choosing between the all standard sentence, that's the blue bars, and the sentence with one of the other 2 variables under study. So Day for TH stopping, or Trent for constant cluster reduction. I want to play them for you, but I don't think I shared my sound. I'm going to stop right quick and share again. All right. Here's your all standard sentence.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
You heard that? Yeah? Great. Okay, and here is TH stopping.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
And your reduced cluster.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
All right. Okay, and we see that these blue bars are larger in both conditions. So listeners reliably choose that all standard sentence as more professional sounding. Across all conditions I tested, and please ask for more results later if you'd like, I can confidently report that all 3 variables are dispreferred in this context. Understanding why TH stopping isn't as harmful will take more work, but I do have some ideas, so please ask for that as well. These results overall indicate that Black professionals are less successful in conveying professionalism when features of non-standard racialized varieties are present. It would seem then that Black professionals do indeed need to engage in style shifting practices in sociolinguistic labor, which moves their linguistic production towards more standardized varieties to be perceived as professional sounding. That if they choose to sound more like themselves at work, their identities as professionals are more likely to be rejected by audiences. With these findings in mind, I'd like to offer some final connected themes for where this research is headed generally and discuss what I'd like to see in the study of African American languages overall. And I'll preface this by underscoring that my intellectual curiosity is seated in the voice and how it functions in the mind and the world. And I find no fault in others who also seat themselves within the core. That said, the design of the MMSI addresses one of the more stark issues of inequity in linguistic theoretical development, and that is phonocentrism. The study of speech has been prioritized over the past 50 years in linguistic inquiry at the expense of all other forms of communication, not only over other forms of linguistic structure. Many linguists and language-related experts from other fields maintain the belief that speech is the only viable and acceptable form of languaging. And this has palpable consequences, not only in our theory, but in the wider world for language users. This matters for considering the ways in which language users could and should be interviewed about their language use and the parts of their linguistic production worth analyzing once they've shared their experiences with their whole bodies in front of whatever recording equipment they've consented to. Sociolinguistic survey methods that were initially developed in part to address what was viewed as underperformance by Black students in urban school districts contributed to deficit models by delimiting who was Black enough to interview about African American English and what could be counted as examples of the racialized language they produced from a set of previously described so-called vernacular features. Although the intentions behind this early sociolinguistic work may have been altruistic, what resulted has become a decades-long campaign on the part of Black linguists and Black people to defend the validity, uniqueness, but not exoticization and heterogeneity of Black language and the agency and creativity of its users. This campaign was and is necessary because Black people experience linguistic discrimination every day due to the weaponization of language across institutions, which has cumulative effects on personhood, agency, social mobility, and community development. In this light, what I would like to see happening in the future of AAL studies, no matter what types of linguistic material is being considered therein, is a centering of Black community members in the production and/or reporting of the work. Many researchers take such efforts with Indigenous people, but in fact, we should be taking such efforts with all people, and in my opinion, work on linguistic variation that is not meaningfully engaging with or reporting the perspectives of the communities it is researching should never be accepted for publication moving forward. Now, not every study is embedded in a community, but every study in our field is analyzing language, and you can't make language without a body. What that necessitates then is a concerted and purposeful recognition of the bodies and beings that provide us with our data, regardless of our research question. Wright 2022 also introduces a model for demographic surveys that can aid us in capturing more information about our participant populations, because being thorough necessitates being accessible and representative. And it is my hope that every single study for the rest of time will report full demographics of its participants, so we may always learn as much as possible about the phenomena we research, and that the fullest extent of the scientific method may be realized as our theory develops through generations of replication. It really is just about prioritizing language users. And with that, we are coming to our large group discussion, maybe. So I've given you a lot, and I really do want to have this take the form of a large group discussion if possible. I'm really most interested in hearing from students, but I've listed points here just so you wouldn't have to stare at nothing. We can flow into questions however you would like this section to progress. I'll put up my contact information momentarily. And again, thanks. Language objectification is a subject that has challenged me from day one in this field, and I don't claim to have answers. I'm just really grateful for a space to tool around with a big idea in. So thank you very much. I'm gonna just take a breath and pause for a moment.
Well, I don't mind saying, Kelly, that was absolutely fantastic, that whole presentation. I mean, I'm blown away. So I can't wait to hear some of the questions that folks in the field have.
Mhm.
So we have some folks here in person, and I've given them the go ahead that they're free to ask questions or make comments. But also I'll open up the floor if anyone has questions or comments. And if not, I have several. So I just don't want to take up all the time. So feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom mechanism.
Just for a second. In case, so people can get it. I've got the questions. I'll put them in the chat.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So one question, and I'm sure this is something you've been asked a lot recently with large language models such as ChatGPT sort of coming to the forefront, both in linguistics and more generally. So do you have any thoughts on how we have this, supposedly disembodied language production tool that is fundamentally sort of scraping the language experience from embodied language users, and how that sort of relationship might be represented in the output from these large language models, or anything else related to those?
Yeah, this is a fair question. I think in some ways, it's certainly still out, like what these models are going to do, or how they're maybe going to reshape how we interact with each other, or text, or what we think about it as. I am probably, I don't know, in a lot of ways, the wrong linguist to ask this question to, and which is, what I have said to a few others who have asked. I think the embodiment thing is certainly at a remove, in the same way it would be with a sign you saw on the, a wall or something that was carved in a stone. Somebody did it, but you don't know who. You're very far away from those people. A human being trained that algorithm. It was trained on text that was made by people eventually, or, somewhere along the line, a human produced something that made that machine go, like all other machines, and so, and it's so far away from the complexity of a neuron that, to me, whatever it can produce, even though it's doing it much faster, the actual analytics of it aren't going to be as complex as our own thought. And so we're never going to be fooled all the way fooled. I mean, when people are saying this thing about images too, but when we look at like old CGI, that we were like, oh my God, this is the best thing that's ever happened to my life, when it like first came out. And then like now, you look at it and it looks like, like paper dolls, right? It's like, it's not, these things evolve as we evolve. And so I feel like what now feels undiscernible to folks will become very quickly discernible, as all these other leaps in technology have. But that's my opinion. Maybe I should be more scared.
Great, thank you. And I'll again say, if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand. If not, I will go forever, as most of you know if you've met me. Really quickly, do you mind going back to the TH stopping and what your ideas were about what might be going on there?
Sure, let me pull the slide.
I think you're muted, Kelly.
Yeah.
I don't understand why my slides went so far away so quickly. What has happened?
You're fine. We did have a follow-up question on chat. Oh, okay. If you're getting your slides up.
No, it keeps I'm sorry, please. I don't know what my laptop is doing.
No, you're fine.
I'll figure it out. What was the question?
So we had a follow-up question in the room just about bias in ChatGPT, how we expect that there's bias just in language use, right? And whatever language that it's those sorts of models are being trained on. And so the question was, how do we anticipate that bias and mitigate it? Yeah.
Great question. Yeah, so the bias with ChatGPT specifically is difficult to deal with because it's not, at least the last time I had looked, not all of its sources have been revealed. I think from the other language learning models that I am aware of and the other bias work that I've done on algorithms, I think that they're only as good as what they're trained on, right? And so if we have at least and that's, what the extension of this racialization work is looking at in automatic speech recognition is that, Siri and these other folks that are trained to listen to us were originally only trained on a bunch of California bro dudes. And it was literally a handful of folks at a startup speaking in California. And so they started failing on the Irish and people with deaf accents and Black people and the elderly and, anyone with braces, because they didn't give them any data, even though they were like, English, here's a ton of words, here's a mountain of stuff. So when we think about bias, I think a lot of people think about it as racism or, just stuff that is just the blatant, absolutely 100% bads. But I think that bias can really, in these things, in these machines that are going to be running stuff and generating stuff for us and already are, to just be imbalance in a lot of these data sets. It's just imbalance. It's just that the language data is only really coming from one place, and one place could be the Western world. One place could be just a dialect region, just one dialect region, or the 20th century even of text. That is imbalance, and so I don't think people really look because the big bad issues are so big bad and have real consequences, and we are not addressing them, and they need to be addressed. I think that people don't look at that foundational layer that is quite porous to say what were we already missing in the beginning. That, yeah, to me is these whole things were biased when we sent them out to begin with, and so we have expectations of something that runs well that sort of never really worked well.
Great. And it looks like we have a question from Maddie in the chat, so feel free to unmute. Oh, and the slides are here.
Perfect.
Maddie can ask her question, please.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right, good. I just want to be sure before. I wanted to just bring up a question concerning the equity. I was thinking of a story I heard where a symphony was doing auditions and they put up a curtain to try to make it equal between men and women, to who would be hired, and they still found that more men were hired, and they found that they had to put down carpet because they could hear the heels of the women as they came into play. So in a lot of equality things, I see that they often try to eliminate as many of the differences as possible to bring about equity. Are you hoping that to bring equity, we show all the differences? I'm thinking about that because I know one of the things that's stopping that is because of the inherent set in unfortunate either racism or bias towards ableism. And I know that's something we need to work towards. And as you talked about, we have learned in science to really make sure we have a control and that everything's controlled. So I don't have a possible idea as to how we could best do that. I'm sure we could find a way, but I'm just wondering, is that what we are hoping towards, is to find equality in all of the differences and consider those, opposed to trying to single them out?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think you're really getting at something very fundamental, I think, in like organizing work or activist work in these inclusion spaces. I think that is really a fundamental question, is what is the end goal? Is the end goal like, you know, the melting pot? That's like one of my bugbear like images. I don't like that. A melting pot, you think like it's all orange, like there's nothing in there. There's nothing unique in there anymore. We've all become one gelatinous thing, as opposed to like a salad where there's like everything is still whole and interesting and its own thing. Like, you know what each ingredient is, but it's still also a cohesive meal. And so what are we working towards? Like, do we want everybody to actually be able to assimilate to something that makes sense? Like, are we going to assimilate into utopia? That'd be cool. Or are we like, yeah, are we going to find a place for all of us to be who we are? And that's okay. And so like, I think that question gets applied, or the answer to that question manifests differently depending on what your task is. Right? If you're talking about like designing something for yourself, for an experiment, for the classroom, if you're asking, what do I do as a human being when I walk out into the world as a listener, as a perceiver? I think that sort of reckoning with what equity looks like in all of those different moments maybe is the first step for a lot, is to just say, how is there only one path here to reach the goal? That doesn't seem to serve everyone in this room. How can we do X? Or, that really frustrated me. This person is really bothering me and I don't know why. Like, it's like, I find myself really questioning my perception of some things, a lot of things, many, many things, and putting things in front of my face that bother me. So that I can be less bothered by them, because I know that like so much of my experience is echo chambered. I'm rambling. I don't know if any of that answered your question, Maddie.
No, it's all good, because I understand that it must be situation by situation based. And I think unfortunately a lot of people right now, because we don't know how to deal with salads yet, that we have to make our science and our studies and our hiring processes and other things like that through a melting pot basis. Hopefully, as we continue, we can learn how to better appreciate all the parts of the salad. So I think that's a worthy discussion and understandable working progress.
And I'll tell you one thing, it's not easy. Like a lot of folks come to me and ask, okay, give me a list of all the words I can't say, or tell me exactly how to deal with every population in my workplace. And I'm like, I can't. If I gave you a list today, it would be wrong tomorrow, because language is a system that evolves. And so we as a field have such a challenge, because I could tell you there's an issue, but it's very hard for me to give you anyone, the collective you, all of us, to give any administrator who's not a linguist like a reason why something needs to be more equitable. It's really difficult to tell them, like, I need you to change this now, but I also need to check with me like every 6 months to make sure it's still okay. Like linguistic justice in action is messy, and that's probably why it basically doesn't exist in most policy.
Okay, looks like we have one final question from Scott, and then we're going to transition into the student question and answer session. And so anyone who's a student or identifies as such, please feel free to stay on. But Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate this. I know that the faculty have to leave in just a minute, but I wanted to thank you for joining us and for your spirited discussion that was also very interesting. I just had one quick question if you wanted to comment on this. I'm interested in what you said about the research that we publish being embedded in or reflect the communities that we serve. Can you just say a couple more things about that?
Sure, yeah, thanks a lot. I think, at least for me, I feel like not every study is embedded in a community or can be or would reasonably be. You know, a lot of the things we do are very much removed or never really encounter a human. You know, we're just looking at a particular part of language structure. So it doesn't necessarily make sense for those kinds of language, that type of language, like, or those type of studies about language to like really meaningfully engage with communities. But in those senses, like if we're talking about doing grammaticality judgments, for example, we might see studies like that. I feel like very rarely tell us who did those judgments. They might say, I, you know, had 50 people on this website, or these people from this, you know, this type of university, you know, gave me these judgments, but they don't tell us anything about who they were. Very, very rarely does that type of science also include demographics, because it's not relevant to their research question. But those people who did those judgments are still people. They're still like whole people. They're still perceivers who have egocentric and relativistic perspectives on this language production. So that judgment, it's not a blank. It doesn't come out of nowhere. And so that's what I mean about like, at least for these studies, that it doesn't make sense for them to be embedded in a community, but they're getting perceptions from somewhere. They're getting perceptions from whole people. And that to me is something that I would like to see recognized, is that every language user is a whole person. That's all. As far as the community research that's not meaningfully engaging with the community, I think the short answer for that for me is that in my own community, in the South as well, you know, where I'm from regionally and, you know, racialized and to an extent, you know, women's language as well. These three major parts of language that have been studied in sociolinguistics, you know, a lot of those studies haven't really engaged with the communities they're studying. They've looked at us, they, you know, have purposefully stayed away. You know, a lot of our methods don't talk to the people that they listen to or observe.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thanks
for asking.
Thank you all again for joining us. We are going to start the student session now until roughly 5 p.m. Mountain Time. Like I said, feel free to stay on and ask questions or just chat with Kelly. I am going to turn the recording off right now.